So this is a brief introduction to the distinctiveness spectrum. There are two types of distinctiveness with different effects on the nature and scope of protection, in particular, the timing and scope of protection. In analyzing a trademark problem, you should always ask about both conceptual distinctiveness or strength, and then marketplace distinctiveness or strength. Courts will rely more on one or the other depending on the situation and on their preferred outcomes. We begin with Abercrombie and Fitch versus Hunting World, the Second Circuit case. This is extremely influential and it is used by all circuits, so you can confidently cite it wherever you are. Abercrombie has a long history of suing other clothing sellers for trademark infringement and mostly of losing. You don't get the facts here, but what happened was that Abercrombie had a registered trademark on Safari for clothes and shoes, and a competitor began to use Safari or Mini Safari or Safariland on its own clothes. So we get the categories: generic, descriptive, suggestive, arbitrary, or fanciful. Category 1 is not a category of marks because generic terms can't be marks, but courts sometimes talk loosely about this. A generic term is one that refers or has come to be understood as referring to the genus of which a particular product is a species, and we'll cover genericity in greater detail later. The court points out that the lines of demarcation are not always bright. Moreover, a term may be descriptive or generic as applied to one product and arbitrary as applied to another, like the word apple. It may be arbitrary at one time and generic at another, like escalator or aspirin. In fact, it might be easier to think of the spectrum as a circle. If genericity can change over time, then Nabisco's argument about shredded wheat has at least some potential validity. That is, it might have started out as a generic term, but over time it became associated with a single producer. However, you might have to invent and teach the public a separate generic term before we're willing to let that happen. Both highly distinctive marks, highly descriptive marks and fanciful terms like aspirin might be at particular risk of becoming understood as simply the name of the underlying thing and thus generic. Now, as an illustration of line drawing difficulties, the court says ivory is arbitrary for soap. There's a good argument that's actually suggestive. They did pick ivory, a particular color, and not ebony, a different color, nor did they pick bone, which is in some sense a synonym for ivory, for the name for soap, because ivory had the best connotations. The line between arbitrary and suggestive, however, is not as important as the other lines. Both arbitrary and suggestive marks are inherently distinctive and thus immediately registrable and protectable upon use. So you don't have to fret too much about that. On the other hand, we do have to fret a lot about the descriptive versus suggestive line. As a side note, here is the best arbitrary name I've ever seen. Abercrombie also gives us the role of the Lanham Act. Section 2E prohibits the registration of merely descriptive marks, but 2F takes it almost all back. Descriptive marks can be registered if they have become distinctive of the applicant's goods in commerce. The PTO may also accept that the mark has become distinctive on proof of substantially exclusive and continuous use for 5 years. How do you draw the line between suggestive and descriptive, which is the most important one we're going to be looking at today? A term is suggestive if it requires imagination, thought, and perception to figure out the relationship between the goods and services and the term. It's descriptive if it conveys an immediate idea of the ingredients, qualities, or characteristics of the goods or services. And that is where we will start in class. Thank you.